In 1994, South Africa held its first democratic election. Nelson Mandela became president. The world called it a miracle, and in many ways, it was. But here's the question that haunts every honest South African political conversation. Apartheid divided South Africans by race. 14 categories of race, enforced by law, backed by violence. 30 years later, South Africans divide themselves by nationality, by language group, by tribe, by province, and they attack each other with the same ferocity that apartheid once directed at all of them. So the question is, did apartheid's divide and rule strategy end? Or did it simply change the lines it draws? Today we go deep into that question. And I promise you, the answer will make you look at Southern African politics completely differently. This episode provides the deepest historical root system, apartheid's legacy, as the structural template for contemporary division. Before we continue, it is important to understand the mission behind Griot Wave Academy. This platform was created to preserve knowledge, culture, music, and stories that often go unheard or are forgotten. Griot Wave is not just about content. It is about building independent systems of learning, creativity, and empowerment. Through books, audio, technology, and media, the goal is to transform timeless wisdom into practical tools for today's generation and future generations. This slide introduces the central argument of the presentation. The claim is not simply that apartheid oppressed people. That much is universally recognized. The deeper claim is that apartheid was an engineering project. It deliberately constructed systems of division designed to fragment solidarity, shape identities, control movement, allocate resources, and manage political behavior. The end of apartheid in 1994 dismantled the legal framework of racial domination, but laws are often easier to remove than habits, institutions, narratives, and social structures. The question we explore is not whether apartheid ended. It did. The question is which parts of its architecture survived. We begin by examining what apartheid actually engineered. Racial categories, tribal homelands, linguistic separation, economic exclusion, and carefully managed competition between communities. These were not accidental outcomes. They were deliberate political designs. We then investigate how concepts such as tribes, ethnic identities, and homeland politics were shaped, reinforced, and sometimes weaponized through colonial administration and racial governance. Understanding how identities were constructed helps explain how they can later be mobilized for political purposes. Next, we separate continuity from change. Some structures disappeared after 1994. Others adapted and persisted in new forms. The task is to identify these continuities with evidence rather than ideology. From there, we trace how old patterns of division continue to appear in contemporary politics, whether expressed through xenophobia, ethnic mobilization, regional antagonism, or identity-based political campaigns. The logic often remains familiar: divide communities, redirect frustration, and weaken collective demands for accountability. Finally, we ask what genuine decolonization requires. If inherited divisions continue to shape political behavior, then liberation cannot be limited to changing laws or governments. It must also involve dismantling the social, economic, and psychological structures that keep people separated from one another. The core argument of this presentation is therefore simple. Apartheid was not only a system of oppression, it was a system of division. To understand many of today's political tensions, we must examine not only what apartheid was, but what parts of its architecture remain active long after its formal end. This slide provides the roadmap for the journey ahead. It introduces the 5 major questions that guide our investigation into how division was engineered, how it evolved, and how it continues to shape society today. We begin with the architecture of apartheid division itself. Apartheid was not simply a collection of discriminatory laws. It was a comprehensive system designed to organize society through race, tribe, homeland, language, and economic geography. Understanding the blueprint is essential before we can understand its legacy. Next, we examine the manufacture of tribe. African identities were often far more fluid and interconnected than colonial administrators and anthropologists suggested. Yet these identities were increasingly fixed into rigid political categories that could be counted, managed, separated, and governed. We explore how identity became a tool of administration and control. The third section asks a critical question. What changed in 1994, and what did not? Political liberation transformed South Africa in profound ways, but inherited patterns of inequality, settlement, economic exclusion, and social fragmentation did not disappear overnight. We distinguish genuine ruptures from enduring continuities. The fourth section turns to the present. If the old racial dividing lines became less acceptable, what replaced them? We investigate how nationality, language, ethnicity, and born-here identity have increasingly become new boundaries through which old political strategies can be reactivated. The labels may change, but the underlying logic often remains familiar. Finally, we ask what genuine decolonization requires. If division was deliberately constructed, then unity must be deliberately constructed as well. Decolonization is not only about removing old systems, it is about creating new institutions, narratives, and relationships capable of overcoming inherited fragmentation. Taken together, these 5 acts tell a single story. They trace a continuous thread from the earliest colonial structures, through apartheid, into the democratic era, and into contemporary political life. The central question throughout is simple but profound. If division was engineered, can it also be dismantled? The rest of this presentation seeks to answer that question. This chapter begins with a simple but often overlooked idea. Apartheid was not merely a system of oppression. It was a system of design. It was carefully engineered to organize people, communities, and resources in ways that would make unity difficult and control easier. When many people think about apartheid, they think about racial segregation. But race was only one layer of a much larger architecture. The system also divided people by tribe, homeland, language, geography, and economic opportunity. Every aspect of society was mapped, classified, and structured to ensure that different communities would see themselves as separate rather than connected. This chapter explores how that architecture was built. We examine the racial categories that defined who belonged where. We investigate the homeland system that fragmented African political power into separate administrative units. We analyze how language and identity were used to create boundaries between people who often shared common interests. And we trace the economic geography that concentrated wealth, opportunity, and infrastructure in some places, while deliberately withholding them from others. Most importantly, we ask a deeper question. Why was this necessary? The answer is that divided populations are easier to govern than united populations. A society organized around competing identities spends less time building collective power and more time managing internal differences. As we move through this chapter, it is important to understand that we are not simply studying history. We are examining a blueprint. Because once a system of division has been built, its effects often outlive the laws that created it. Political systems can change overnight. Social habits, economic patterns, institutional structures, and inherited identities often remain for generations. The goal of this chapter is therefore not only to understand apartheid as a historical phenomenon, but to understand its design logic. By understanding how division was engineered, we are better equipped to recognize when similar patterns reappear in new forms. Before we can discuss what survived apartheid, we must first understand how the original architecture was constructed. This slide reveals an important truth. Apartheid was not a single law or policy. It was a complete system of social engineering. Each component reinforced the others, creating an architecture designed not only to oppress, but to prevent organized resistance and collective political power. At the center was racial classification. Every person was assigned a legal identity that determined where they could live, work, study, and whom they could marry. Race became an administrative tool for distributing opportunity and restricting freedom. The homeland system went further. Millions of Black South Africans were stripped of meaningful citizenship and assigned to fragmented homelands. Political rights were removed, while labor could still be extracted. The goal was clear: separate Black political power from the South African state while maintaining economic dependence. Past laws controlled movement. Black South Africans could not freely seek work, settle where opportunities existed, or move without permission. Labor was needed, but permanent urban citizenship was not. The Group Areas Act reshaped geography itself. Communities were uprooted, families displaced, and cities redesigned around racial separation. The township-suburb divide visible today did not emerge naturally, it was engineered. Education was also weaponized. Bantu education was explicitly designed to prepare Black South Africans for subordinate economic roles. By controlling education, the state controlled future opportunity. Finally, tribal administrative control fragmented African unity. Ethnic identities were institutionalized through separate administrations and compliant chiefs. Communities that shared common interests were encouraged to see themselves as separate political groups. What unites all 6 systems is their purpose. They were not random acts of discrimination. Together, they formed a sophisticated mechanism for controlling land, labor, movement, identity, education, and political organization. The key insight is that apartheid's greatest achievement was not simply segregation. It was fragmentation. A population divided by race, geography, language, tribe, and economic status is far less capable of building collective power. As we move forward, keep one question in mind. If these systems were designed to create division, how much of that architecture survived the end of apartheid? Understanding the blueprint is the first step toward understanding its legacy. This slide makes a crucial point. Apartheid was not only a political system, it was a geographic system. It reshaped land, cities, transport networks, schools, and economic opportunity in ways that continue to influence daily life decades after its formal end. The numbers on this slide tell the story of a map that still carries the imprint of apartheid's design. Consider the land question. The homeland system confined the overwhelming majority of Black South Africans to a small fraction of the country's territory, creating patterns of settlement and ownership that remain deeply contested today. The legal system changed in 1994, but the physical landscape did not. The average township commute tells a similar story. Millions of South Africans still travel long distances every day between where they live and where economic opportunity exists. These journeys are not accidental. They are the result of deliberate planning that separated labor from wealth, workers from workplaces, and communities from economic centers. The cost is paid daily in time, income, and quality of life. The wealth gap reflects another legacy. Generations of unequal access to land, education, finance, and property ownership created disparities that cannot be explained by individual effort alone. Wealth accumulates across generations, and so does exclusion. Education remains tied to geography as well. Many of the lowest performing schools are located in areas shaped by apartheid-era planning and historic underinvestment. This demonstrates how spatial inequality often reproduces educational inequality. The persistence of former homeland jurisdictions highlights another important reality. Administrative boundaries, political identities, and regional inequalities often survive long after the laws that created them disappear. Finally, the enormous cost of transport subsidies reveals how expensive inherited geography can be. Governments continue to spend billions addressing problems created by a spatial design intended to separate people from opportunity. The broader lesson is simple. Apartheid was designed on a map, and many of its consequences remain visible on that same map today. If we want to understand contemporary inequality, unemployment, service delivery challenges, and social tensions, we must look not only at current policies but at the geography that continues to shape people's lives. History is not only remembered, it is lived through the spaces people inhabit every day. This slide shifts the conversation from geography to economics. If the previous slide showed that apartheid remains visible on the map, this slide shows that it also remains visible in the balance sheet. The key question is not whether South Africa has changed since 1994, it clearly has. The question is how much of the underlying economic architecture has changed. The data suggests that while political power transferred, economic power transferred far more slowly. Look first at the income distribution. The trend shows progress. The share of national income going to Black South Africans has increased significantly since the end of apartheid, while the share going to white South Africans has declined. That is real movement. But progress and transformation are not the same thing. Nearly 3 decades after democracy, the distribution of economic rewards remains profoundly unequal. The Gini coefficient tells the same story from another angle. South Africa remains one of the most unequal societies on earth. Despite democratic reforms, inequality has proven remarkably resistant to change because it is embedded in structures, not simply attitudes. The unemployment figures reveal perhaps the most damaging legacy. A large gap in employment opportunities continues to separate communities, limiting social mobility and reinforcing cycles of poverty. Work remains the primary pathway to economic participation, and unequal access to work reproduces unequal outcomes. The wealth gap is even more revealing than the income gap. Income is what people earn. Wealth is what families accumulate and pass on across generations. Property, investments, businesses, and inherited assets compound over time. That is why wealth disparities often outlive legal discrimination by decades. Finally, ownership matters. Corporate control determines who makes investment decisions, allocates capital, and benefits from long-term economic growth. Representation in management is important, but ownership remains the deeper measure of economic power. The broader lesson is that systems can survive the laws that created them. Political apartheid ended in 1994, but economic structures built over generations do not disappear overnight. Understanding contemporary inequality requires looking beyond individual success stories and examining the architecture beneath the economy itself. The question is no longer whether change occurred, but whether the pace and depth of that change have been sufficient to dismantle the foundations of exclusion. This chapter is the most intellectually provocative because it challenges a deep assumption that tribes are natural, ancient, primordial African institutions. They are not. The tribal identities that divide Africans today are primarily colonial constructions, codified by European missionaries and anthropologists, given legal force by colonial administrators, and then weaponized by both colonial and post-colonial political elites. This is not to say that pre-colonial African societies had no ethnic, linguistic, or cultural distinctions. They did. But the fixed, legal, administratively enforced tribal categories that we know today, those are colonial inventions. Let us look at the evidence. This slide introduces one of the most important and often misunderstood arguments in the study of African political identity. It is based heavily on the work of political theorist and historian Mahmoud Mamdani, particularly his landmark book Citizen and Subject, 1996, which remains essential reading for understanding how colonial rule reshaped African societies. The argument is not that ethnic identities did not exist before colonialism. They did. The argument is that colonial administrations transformed fluid, overlapping and often changing identities into fixed political categories called tribes. What had once been flexible social affiliations became legal, administrative, and political identities. Consider the example of the Zulu kingdom. Before the rise of Shaka in the 1820s, there was no Zulu nation in the modern sense of a fixed ethnic group. Shaka's state was created through political and military consolidation, incorporating multiple clans and communities into a larger political unit. The idea that the Zulu were an ancient, unchanging tribe, stretching unchanged into the distant past, is largely a retrospective construction. Political identity was dynamic. Colonial administration later recast it as primordial. The second mechanism was knowledge production. Missionaries, anthropologists, and colonial officials classified African societies according to European assumptions about race, ethnicity, and hierarchy. Complex realities were simplified into neat categories that could be mapped, recorded, and governed. The third mechanism was the colonial census. As Benedict Anderson observed, states create communities by naming and counting them. Once colonial governments required individuals to belong to a single tribe on official forms, that category became legally real. Identity was no longer something negotiated socially, it became something recorded by the state. Finally, British indirect rule, articulated by Lord Lugard, governed through selected chiefs rather than large colonial bureaucracies. It was efficient and inexpensive, but it also transformed chiefs into intermediaries of colonial authority. Their power increasingly derived not from their communities, but from the colonial state itself. The lasting lesson is profound. Colonialism did not simply govern African identities, it reorganized and institutionalized them. Many of the categories that still shape politics today were not ancient inheritances. They were administrative creations that became political realities through law, census-taking, and colonial governance. This slide takes us from theory to implementation. If the previous slide explained how colonial governments transformed fluid identities into fixed tribes, this slide shows how apartheid turned those tribal categories into a system of political control. The homeland, or Bantustan system, was presented as a policy of cultural self-determination. In reality, it was a strategy to fragment black political power. Instead of one black majority with national political claims, apartheid created multiple ethnic administrations, each confined to separate territories, each competing for resources, and each prevented from forming a unified political bloc. Notice that many of these homelands were economically non-viable. Venda, Gazankulu, and others lacked the land, infrastructure, and economic base necessary for genuine independence. Their purpose was not development. Their purpose was administrative separation. By assigning citizenship to homelands, apartheid could claim black South Africans no longer belonged to South Africa politically, while still relying on their labor economically. Two examples deserve particular attention. First, KwaZulu. During the 1980s and early 1990s, the Homeland Administration became a key vehicle for what later became known as Third Force violence. Through the Inkatha Freedom Party and homeland structures, resources, weapons, and political patronage flowed into a conflict that claimed an estimated 14,000 lives in KwaZulu-Natal. The homeland system was not merely preserving culture, it was being used as an instrument of political warfare. This demonstrates how tribal administration could be mobilized for political ends. Second, the Sotho-speaking population. Rather than allowing a large and potentially influential political community to exist as a single entity, Sotho speakers were divided across Laboa, Kwakwa, and areas designated as White South Africa. The effect was fragmentation. A unified population of millions became several smaller, more manageable administrative units. The Bophuthatswana case is often cited as evidence that traditional authority can generate prosperity through mineral ownership. The Royal Bafokeng Nation is indeed an important and largely unique example. But it is exceptional, not typical. For most homeland populations, mineral wealth benefited administrators and mining interests far more than ordinary residents. The larger lesson is that Bantustans were not cultural projects. They were political technology. Their function was to divide, fragment, and manage populations in ways that reduced the possibility of unified resistance. Understanding that design helps explain why questions of identity, territory, and political belonging remain so powerful in South Africa today. This slide widens the lens. Up to this point, we have focused on South Africa, but the central argument is that the logic of division was not unique to apartheid. It was part of a broader colonial governance model applied across the continent by different European powers, using remarkably similar methods. The pattern is strikingly consistent. First, fluid identities are classified. Second, those classifications are recorded in censuses and identity documents. Third, they become administrative categories. Fourth, political elites inherit those categories and mobilize them during moments of competition and crisis. Rwanda is perhaps the clearest and most tragic example. Before Belgian rule, Hutu and Tutsi were largely socioeconomic identities, not fixed racial groups. Through cattle ownership and social mobility, movement between categories was possible. Belgian colonial authorities, supported by Catholic missions, transformed these fluid identities into permanent racial classifications and embedded them in identity cards during the 1930s. What had once been flexible became fixed. 70 years later, those hardened categories became the fault lines along which the 1994 genocide unfolded. The same logic appears elsewhere. In Nigeria, colonial administrative divisions and indirect rule reinforced regional, religious, and ethnic distinctions that continue to shape politics today. In the Congo, colonial censuses created and institutionalized hundreds of officially recognized tribal categories, many of which later became political and military identities. In Côte d'Ivoire, the concept of *ivoirité* transformed questions of belonging into tools of political exclusion. The key point is not that colonialism explains everything. Contemporary leaders, movements, and institutions make choices and bear responsibility for those choices. But those choices occur within frameworks that were often created decades earlier. The larger lesson is this. When we look at conflicts in Rwanda, the DRC, Nigeria, or elsewhere, we should be cautious about dismissing them as ancient tribal hatreds or timeless African divisions. Many of the categories involved were shaped, codified, and politicized through colonial administration, census systems, and European anthropological theories. The fingerprints of those systems remain visible. Understanding that history does not remove responsibility from present actors, but it helps explain why certain divisions continue to be so politically powerful, and why they are repeatedly activated during moments of political competition. There is no question that 1994 was one of the most important years in modern history. For the first time, millions of Black South Africans could vote in a democratic election. A system built on racial exclusion, legal discrimination, and political disenfranchisement formally ended. The images of long queues stretching for kilometers became symbols of hope around the world. The world celebrated, and rightly so. But history does not end with celebration. Political science asks a different question. What institutions were dismantled? What structures survived? And what forms of power changed hands? The answer is complex. Political power was transferred. Legal apartheid ended. The vote was universal. Parliament, the presidency, and the machinery of government became democratically accountable. These were profound transformations that should never be minimized. But many of the deeper structures of society were not transferred with the ballot box. The geography of apartheid remained largely intact. The distribution of wealth remained highly unequal. Corporate ownership changed slowly. Land ownership patterns endured. Townships remained physically separated from economic opportunity. The inherited architecture of inequality survived the transition. This chapter is not an argument against 1994. It is an argument for understanding it accurately. The democratic transition represented a historic rupture with apartheid law, but not necessarily a complete rupture with apartheid's economic and spatial foundations. That distinction matters because many of the challenges South Africa faces today, persistent inequality, unemployment, spatial exclusion, service delivery crises, and social frustration, cannot be understood without recognizing both the successes and the limits of the transition. The central question guiding this chapter is therefore not whether apartheid ended. It did. The question is which parts of the system were dismantled, which parts adapted and survived, and how those surviving structures continue to shape life 3 decades later. To understand South Africa in 2024, we must first understand exactly what was won in 1994 and what remained unfinished. This slide addresses one of the most contested questions in modern South African history. What exactly was negotiated at the end of apartheid, and what compromises shaped the democracy that emerged? It is important to begin with balance. The gains of 1994 were extraordinary. Universal suffrage, constitutional democracy, freedom of movement, legal equality, labor rights, and the formal destruction of apartheid's racial laws represented a historic transformation. Millions gained rights that had been denied for generations. But every negotiation involves trade-offs. The question is not whether democracy was worth it. It unquestionably was. The question is what concessions were made in order to secure a peaceful transition. One of the most significant was the Sunset Clause. During the CODESA negotiations, protections were provided for existing civil servants, security personnel, and pension arrangements. As a result, the first democratic government inherited much of the apartheid-era administrative machinery. Political authority changed rapidly. Institutional culture changed far more slowly. Land was another major compromise. The adoption of the, quote, willing seller, willing buyer principle meant land reform would proceed through market transactions, rather than large-scale redistribution. Supporters argued this prevented economic disruption. Critics argue it dramatically slowed transformation and left ownership patterns largely intact decades later. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission reflected a similar compromise between peace and justice. The TRC prioritized truth-telling and national reconciliation over widespread prosecution. It revealed important facts about apartheid abuses, but many victims felt accountability remained incomplete, and many perpetrators never faced legal consequences. The economic settlement remains perhaps the most debated aspect of all. South Africa entered democracy within a global economic environment that strongly favored market liberalization, investor confidence, and fiscal stability. The result was an economic framework that achieved macroeconomic stability, but left deeper questions of ownership, wealth distribution, and structural inequality largely unresolved. The central lesson is not that the settlement failed. Without compromise, South Africa may have faced civil war or prolonged instability. Rather, the lesson is that political liberation and structural transformation are not the same thing. The negotiations transferred political power, but many economic, spatial, and institutional structures survived. To understand South Africa today, we must hold both truths simultaneously. 1994 was a remarkable democratic victory, and an incomplete social and economic revolution. This slide contains what is arguably the most important analytical argument in this chapter. The question is not whether apartheid ended, it did. The question is which structures disappeared, and which survived in altered form. The side-by-side comparison reveals a pattern. In each case, the legal framework changed, but significant elements of the underlying system remained. Take spatial segregation. Cape Town provides perhaps the clearest example. Under the Group Areas Act, black and colored communities were forcibly removed from places like District 6 and relocated to the Cape Flats, while affluent areas remained overwhelmingly white. 30 years into democracy, the map looks remarkably familiar. The Cape Flats remained disproportionately poor. The Atlantic seaboard and Constantia remained disproportionately wealthy. The apartheid map became the democratic map. Education shows a similar continuity. Formal racial exclusion ended, but educational outcomes continued to reflect historical inequalities. Former Model C schools and former township schools operate within vastly different realities. The law changed quickly. Institutional capacity and accumulated advantage changed much more slowly. The continuity of traditional authority is perhaps the least discussed. Homeland administrations formally disappeared, yet traditional leadership structures retained significant influence over land and local governance in many former homeland regions. The Ingonyama Trust in KwaZulu-Natal, which controls millions of hectares of land, demonstrates how administrative systems rooted in the homeland era continue to shape governance today. Different legislation but recognizably similar structures of authority. The labor market tells a related story. Apartheid's job reservation laws are gone, yet patterns of management, ownership, and opportunity remain deeply unequal. Formal barriers disappeared, but historical advantages continue to influence outcomes. Finally, consider the security state. The Zondo Commission revealed how elements within the state security agency employed surveillance, infiltration, and political disruption tactics against perceived opponents. The institutions changed names, governments changed, and legal frameworks changed, but certain operational habits persisted. The larger lesson is that political transitions rarely begin with a blank slate. Institutions, geographies, networks, and habits often outlive the systems that created them. Understanding contemporary South Africa requires recognizing both the ruptures of 1994 and the continuities that survived it. History does not simply disappear when a law is repealed. Sometimes it remains embedded in the landscape, the economy, and the institutions of everyday life. If you are serious about Africa's future, you must also become serious about personal growth, execution, discipline, entrepreneurship, and building. Knowledge without implementation changes nothing. That is exactly why I'm building the Griot Wave Inner Circle, an execution-focused community for builders, creators, entrepreneurs, and purpose-driven individuals. A space focused on accountability, implementation, entrepreneurship, transformation, AI and digital leverage, community, and real progress. Weekly live sessions, execution systems, focused builders, real conversations, real growth. If you are tired of consuming endlessly and ready to start building intentionally, scan the QR code or use the link below to join the early interest list. Stop consuming, start building. Don't build alone. Join the Griot Wave Inner Circle and connect with a community focused on real execution and transformation. Scan the QR code to begin. This slide requires nuance because it examines one of the most powerful and inspiring ideas in modern South African history, the Rainbow Nation. The purpose is not to dismiss that vision. It is to ask a political science question. What did the Rainbow Nation project achieve, and what problems was it unable to solve? Nelson Mandela himself recognized this tension. The quotation at the top is important because it reminds us that reconciliation was never meant to mean forgetting. Mandela understood that healing required confronting the long-term consequences of apartheid, not pretending they had disappeared. The Rainbow Nation framework achieved something extraordinary. It helped prevent large-scale civil conflict. It created a shared national identity at a moment when the country could easily have fractured. It encouraged forgiveness in a society emerging from immense violence. These achievements should not be underestimated. But reconciliation and transformation are not the same thing. The first myth examined here is the idea that unity automatically produces equality. Political reconciliation occurred much faster than economic redistribution. South Africans entered the same democracy, but they did not enter it with the same resources, opportunities, or inherited advantages. The second debate concerns non-racialism. As a democratic principle, non-racial citizenship is essential. The challenge arises when formal equality is confused with substantive equality. If wealth, education, land ownership, and social networks remain shaped by apartheid's legacy, then treating unequal starting positions as though they are already equal can unintentionally preserve existing disparities. The third issue is economic transformation. Programs such as BEE and BBBEE created opportunities for many Black professionals and entrepreneurs. Yet critics argue that ownership patterns changed more slowly than expected. Practices such as documented BEE fronting highlighted the gap between transformation on paper and transformation in reality. Finally, the Constitution guarantees equal rights, but rights and access are not always the same thing. A legal remedy exists only if citizens can realistically access courts, lawyers, and institutions capable of enforcing those rights. The central argument is not that the Rainbow Nation failed. Rather, it succeeded in achieving national reconciliation, while leaving unresolved questions about economic justice, structural inequality, and historical repair. The challenge facing South Africa today is how to preserve the achievements of reconciliation, while completing the transformation that reconciliation alone could not deliver. Here is where the history becomes the present. Apartheid divided people by race. It created a legal hierarchy based on invented biological categories. It denied political rights based on those categories. It used those categories to extract labor, control movement, and prevent solidarity. Today, 32 years later, a significant portion of South African political culture divides people by nationality. It creates an informal hierarchy of, quote, real South Africans over foreigners. It denies social rights based on national identity. It uses those categories to displace economic frustration and prevent multinational working-class solidarity. Is that a coincidence? Or is it the same template with a new variable substituted in? This comparative table is the intellectual heart of the episode. The argument it makes: you do not need to be a racist to reproduce apartheid's social function. You need only to substitute a different dividing category, and the same economic and political logic operates. Economic function row. This is the most important. Migrant workers in South African townships accept lower wages than local workers, partly because they have no political representation and few rights. This creates downward wage pressure that benefits employers, who get cheaper labor, while increasing competition for local workers, who see wages suppressed. The apartheid system suppressed Black wages through a different legal mechanism, but the economic outcome was structurally similar. Media framing. Die Swart Gevaar, Black Danger, was the apartheid-era propaganda framework used in the Afrikaner press to frame Black political demands as existential threats to white society. The current framework, Foreigners Bring Crime, performs the same function in community radio and social media. It frames the economic migrant as an existential threat to South African culture and jobs. I am not saying xenophobia is the same as apartheid. I am saying it uses the same social technology, manufactured threat of the other, in service of the same political and economic function. This slide makes the argument that ethnic/tribal politics in democratic SA is the direct continuation of Homeland-era ethnic mobilization. MK Party 2024 election. The MK Party's May 2024 election performance, 14.6% nationally, 44.9% in KZN, is the most dramatic demonstration of Zulu ethnic mobilization in post-apartheid politics. Exit polls showed MK support was overwhelmingly concentrated in KwaZulu-Natal and among Zulu-speaking voters. The party's central campaign themes: Zulu royalism, Jacob Zuma's personal persecution narrative, isiZulu language media dominance, were explicitly ethnic mobilization tools. DA colored vote. The colored political identity in the Western Cape is one of the most studied phenomena in South African political science. The category was created by the Population Registration Act. Voters classified as colored in 1950 were politically allocated to the separate Colored Representative Council, then the tricameral parliament, then the NP's moderate base. Today they form the DA's most loyal constituency. An apartheid-era classification still drives voting behavior 74 years later. EFF's non-ethnic claim. This is a genuine tension in EFF politics. The party's pan-Africanist rhetoric is anti-ethnic. Its xenophobic campaign rhetoric creates a de facto ethnic category. Both are simultaneously true. The Ingonyama Trust is the single most powerful example of apartheid-era institutional architecture surviving into the democratic era. Last day passage. The Ingonyama Trust Act was passed on the 24th of March 1994, one day before the 1994 elections were declared constitutional. It was not debated in a democratic parliament. It was a unilateral act of an apartheid parliament, negotiated as a political deal with Buthelezi. The democratic government inherited it, and has not repealed it in 32 years. PTO versus title deed. This is the key legal distinction. A title deed is a property right. It gives you ownership. A permission to occupy is a personal right. It gives you the right to use the land, but the trust, and through it the king, remains the owner. For rural KwaZulu-Natal residents, this means they cannot access mortgage finance, cannot collateralize their most valuable asset, cannot leave land to heirs with legal certainty. This is precisely the economic exclusion function that the Homeland System was designed to perform. 2022 Constitutional Court. The court ruled that the trust's conversion of PTO rights to rental was unlawful. This was a significant win, but the underlying structure, 2.8 m hectares controlled by traditional authority, remains unchanged. You cannot say apartheid's homelands are gone if their land is still controlled by the same authority, with the same administrative structure, preventing the same population from having formal property rights. That is not transformation. That is rename and continue. The Soweto 1976 anniversary is a useful reference point. June 16th is now Youth Day in South Africa. The uprising began because of language policy, Afrikaans imposition. Language as a tool of control. 48 years later, language is still being used as a tool of control, just with different languages and different targets. MK Party isiZulu campaign. Political analysts at WITS and UCT noted that the MK Party's dominance in KZN was achieved in significant part through isiZulu first media strategy. Their WhatsApp broadcast groups, radio endorsements, and rally communications were overwhelmingly in isiZulu, creating a deliberate cultural in-group and signaling to non-Zulu speakers that MK was not their party. Language as xenophobia. This is documented in ACMS research. In Cape Town, Somali and Ethiopian migrants are identified partly by language accent. Their accented Afrikaans or English marks them as foreign. In Johannesburg townships, Zimbabwean and Mozambican migrants are identified by their lack of isiZulu or Sesotho. Language accent becomes a migration status marker. PIRLS 81%. This statistic should be returned to every time education is discussed. It is the most damning single indicator of the failure of post-apartheid education transformation. The mother tongue instruction gap is one contributing factor. Inadequate teacher training is another. Both are legacies of Bantu education, not resolved by 30 years of democratic governance. Is it progress? Some dimensions, yes. Legal racial classification is gone. Movement is free. Formal legal equality exists. These are real achievements that many South Africans died for. But on the most important dimensions, the dividing function is intact. Same social technology, new variable. The economic inheritance is intact. Racial wealth gap barely moved. The political template is intact. Ethnic mobilization through same traditional authority structures. The institutional inheritance is intact. Ingonyama Trust, traditional authority, township geography, and in one dimension working class solidarity, the situation is arguably worse. Under apartheid, a Soweto resident and a Zimbabwean were both black, both oppressed, both potential comrades. Today, a Soweto resident is encouraged to see the Zimbabwean as the enemy. The cross-community solidarity that led the liberation struggle has been replaced by cross-community antagonism that serves the same elites the liberation struggle was fighting. We have spent 4 chapters documenting what was built, how it was built, what survived, and how it operates today. Now we do the hardest work. We ask what it would take to genuinely dismantle it, not reform it, not rename it, not accommodate it with new language, while preserving the structure. Dismantle it. This is called decolonization, and it is among the most contested political concepts in contemporary African political thought. Some say it means restoring pre-colonial structures. Some say it means creating new post-colonial ones. Some say it means redistributing economic assets. I'm going to argue today that genuine decolonization requires all 3 and a 4th dimension that is often overlooked, the decolonization of the mind. This is the blueprint, and it is deliberately comprehensive. Economic. The land reform failure is not technical. It is political. The ANC government has had the legal mandate, budget allocation, and 32 years to implement land reform. The failure is explained by the dominance of agribusiness interests, the ANC leadership's alignment with commercial agriculture, and the quote, willing seller, willing buyer constraint. Expropriation without compensation, Section 25 Amendment, still not passed after 6 years of debate. Spatial. The most affordable social housing in the democratic world was built by Viennese socialist municipal government in the 1920s-30s. Singapore's HDB Housing Development Board has housed 80% of the population in quality public housing since the 1970s. Both required strong political will to override market dynamics. South Africa has neither allocated the budget nor demonstrated the political will. Psychological. Ngugi W. Thiong'o's Decolonizing the Mind, 1986, argues that the most profound act of colonial control was making Africans see themselves through European eyes as primitive, tribal, backwards. Education that restores the intellectual traditions of African philosophy, Ubuntu, Ma'at, the Ubuntu ethic, as primary, not as supplements to Western philosophy, is the beginning of this dimension. Rwanda Reconciliation Education. Rwanda developed a national reconciliation curriculum post-1994 genocide that teaches the colonial construction of Hutu/Tutsi categories as a central part of the curriculum. Every Rwandan child is taught that the categories that drove the genocide were Belgian inventions. This is one of the most sophisticated applications of decolonial education anywhere in the world. Ubuntu is often used as a platitude by corporations and politicians. This slide rescues it as a serious political philosophy. Ubuntu as migration philosophy. The historical evidence is that pre-colonial Southern African societies had much more fluid population movement than the colonial and apartheid eras. Nguni-speaking peoples, Zulu, Xhosa, Ndebele, had trade networks and kinship links across what is now South Africa, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Zambia. The sharp national borders that make Zimbabweans foreign in Johannesburg were drawn in 1890. Before that, the same people moved across the same land without migration controls. Stokvel as alternative economy. The Stokvel system, rotating credit associations, manages R50 billion plus in South Africa annually. The Ubuntu economic principle is visible here. Community-based capital formation that operates outside the banking system. The same system, called Ikulu in Ethiopia, Ayuto among Somalis, is the source of capital for the very migrant traders that xenophobic campaigns target. Ubuntu economics versus apartheid economics. The Somali shopkeeper's Ayuto is more Ubuntu than the South African politician who attacks their shop. Imbizo Kagotla. These were pre-colonial participatory governance structures, community assemblies, where citizens could speak directly to chiefs. They were not democratic in the Western sense, but they were participatory. The apartheid state replaced them with Bantu authorities, which were top-down, compliant, unaccountable. Post-apartheid governance has yet to genuinely restore community-level participatory democracy in former homeland areas. Rwanda, the most discussed African model of post-conflict identity reconstruction. The abolition of ethnic categories from official documents is significant. It removes the legal basis for the colonial-era classification. But Rwanda's one-party dominant political system, Kagame's 30-year control and restrictions on opposition raise serious questions about democratic decolonization. You cannot decolonize power by concentrating it. Bolivia. Evo Morales' plurinational constitution is the most ambitious formal attempt at indigenous rights recognition in the hemisphere. The hydrocarbon nationalization genuinely funded public services, but it was overturned by a 2019 coup, with the military and right-wing opposition reinstating white elite governance. Decolonization without security of the state is reversible. New Zealand, the Treaty of Waitangi process is the most institutionalized land decolonization process in the world. It has taken 50 years and is still incomplete. Maori poverty persists. But the constitutional recognition of Maori rights as prior to settler law is a significant decolonial principle. Ireland. The Irish comparison is instructive, but limited. Celtic revival was possible because there was a clear pre-colonial cultural tradition to recover, and because the colonizer, Britain, was geographically separated after independence. In South Africa, where colonizer and colonized have shared geography for 370 years, the cultural project is fundamentally more complex. This is the legislative and policy agenda. Concrete, specific, legally grounded. Section 25, Expropriation. The constitutional 18th Amendment to enable expropriation without compensation has been debated since 2018. The 2024 election resulted in the Government of National Unity, ANC plus DA, which has made land reform even more contested. The DA opposes EWC. The ANC is constrained by its coalition partner. The 30% land reform target is further away than ever. Equal per pupil spending. This would require the single largest reallocation of the education budget in democratic South Africa. Former Model C schools are largely funded by parent school fees, a legal mechanism that entrenches inequality. Prohibiting school fees in formerly advantaged schools, while fully funding them from the state, would be the most direct address of the Bantu education legacy. Pan-African Solidarity Curriculum. This is perhaps the most important of all the recommendations, because it addresses the deepest root. If South African children were taught that Mozambicans sheltered the ANC in Maputo, that Zimbabweans died for SA freedom at the Battle of Wenki, that Zambia boycotted Rhodesia at economic cost for Southern African liberation, the narrative of foreigners as enemies would have to compete with a counter-narrative of foreigners as liberation comrades. Memory is the most powerful form of solidarity infrastructure. This presentation concludes not with a diagnosis, but with a responsibility. If the previous chapters have argued that many of Africa's divisions were historically engineered and politically maintained, then the obvious question becomes, who helps build the alternative? This slide argues that the African diaspora is not a spectator to this history. It is one of its most important actors. Historically, some of the most influential Pan-African ideas emerged from the diaspora. Think of W.E.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, C.L.R. James, Frantz Fanon, and many others. They used the intellectual space available to them outside the continent to analyze power, challenge colonial narratives, and imagine alternative futures. That tradition continues today. Supporting African scholarship, publishing, research, and education is not an academic exercise. It is nation-building at a continental scale. The second role is economic. The African diaspora sends well over $100 billion home each year. Most of this money supports families, and that remains important. But part of those resources can also be directed toward long-term institution building. Cooperatives, land trusts, community investment vehicles, and enterprises that create durable economic power rather than temporary consumption. Third is political influence. Millions of Africans and people of African descent live inside the very countries that shaped colonial policy. They vote, organize, lobby, and participate in democratic systems. That creates opportunities to advocate for fair trade, educational reform, archival transparency, reparative justice, and accountability for colonial legacies. Finally, there is culture. Stories shape identity. Films, books, music, podcasts, and digital media can either reinforce inherited divisions or help people see themselves as part of a larger shared history. Cultural production is not separate from politics. It is one of the foundations of political imagination. The larger lesson is that decolonization is not a single event achieved by independence. It is an ongoing process of rebuilding institutions, recovering historical memory, creating economic alternatives, and imagining new forms of solidarity. The diaspora occupies a unique position, connected to Africa, yet embedded within global systems of knowledge, finance, media, and politics. That position is not merely a privilege, it is a responsibility. The question is not whether the diaspora has a role to play. The question is what it chooses to do with that role. Griot Wave audience. If you are watching this from the UK, Europe, or North America, you are in the legislature that made these decisions. Your citizenship gives you access to parliamentary petitions, constituency MPs, and municipal councils that can advocate for colonial accountability. That is not a metaphor. That is a practical tool. Every serious argument rests on a foundation. This slide is not simply a reading list. It is the intellectual architecture behind the analysis presented throughout this work. One of the central themes of this presentation is that many of Africa's contemporary political challenges cannot be understood without understanding how colonial systems shaped identity, citizenship, power, and belonging. Few scholars explain that more clearly than Mahmoud Mamdani. His work, particularly Citizen and Subject, provides the foundational framework for understanding how colonial administrations transformed fluid social realities into rigid political categories that continue to influence African politics today. Frantz Fanon takes the analysis deeper, into the psychology of power. He reminds us that colonialism does not only occupy territory, it occupies the mind. His work remains essential for understanding identity, alienation, nationalism, and the emotional consequences of domination. Cheikh Anta Diop and Ngugi W. Thiong'o address another crucial question: intellectual sovereignty. Diop challenged the idea that Africa lacked civilization before Europe, while Ngugi demonstrated how language itself can become a tool of domination or liberation. Together, they help restore historical confidence and cultural agency. Noel Mostert's work provides the historical detail of how South Africa's spatial and demographic landscape was constructed, while Francis Nyamjo helps explain how ideas of insiders, outsiders, belonging, and exclusion continue to shape politics across the continent. Pumla Gobodo Madikizela and Sisonke Msimang bring a more personal and moral dimension. Their work explores memory, reconciliation, trauma, citizenship, and the unfinished questions left behind by South Africa's democratic transition. The broader lesson is simple. No single book explains Africa. No single ideology explains Africa. But together, these thinkers provide tools for understanding how history became structure, how structure became politics, and how politics continues to shape everyday life. If there is one message to take from this slide, it is this: read African scholars. Read those who studied these questions from within African realities. Intellectual independence begins with intellectual engagement. Before we can transform institutions, we must first understand them, and these authors provide some of the most important maps available for that journey. Throughout this presentation, we have examined systems of division, identity engineering, political scapegoating, and inherited inequality. It would be easy to leave this conversation feeling that these structures are too large, too old, or too deeply embedded to change. This slide is here to make the opposite point. History matters because systems are built by people, and what people build can be dismantled by people. The first level of action is learning the history. Many divisions survive because their origins have been forgotten. When we understand how race, tribe, homeland boundaries, and exclusionary identities were constructed, we become far less vulnerable to political manipulation. Knowledge is the foundation of liberation. The second level is challenging the narrative. Whenever political leaders blame migrants, ethnic groups, or outsiders for complex economic problems, ask the harder question: what policies created those problems? Who benefits from this story? What evidence supports the claim? Critical thinking is one of the most powerful forms of democratic participation. The third level is demanding policy change. Real transformation does not come from slogans. It comes from better schools, fairer economic opportunities, accountable institutions, land reform, effective public services, and equal access to justice. Citizens must push governments to address structural causes rather than symbolic targets. The fourth level is building solidarity. Division succeeds when people see each other as competitors. Progress happens when communities recognize their shared interests. South Africans, Zimbabweans, Mozambicans, Nigerians, Somalis, Ghanaians, and others face many of the same challenges. Cooperation is more powerful than suspicion. The central message of this entire project can be summarized in one sentence. Division was engineered, not inherited. It was designed, maintained, and politically exploited. That means it can also be challenged, dismantled, and replaced. The future will not be determined by those who understand the mechanics of division. It will be determined by those who understand them and choose to build something different. The person your community is attacking today as a foreigner may be from the same country that hid your liberation movement. The Mozambican whose shop was burned may be from Maputo, where the ANC external mission was headquartered for 30 years. The Zimbabwean being deported may have family from Harare, where Oliver Tambo spoke from exile. The Zambian being called Kwerekwere may come from Lusaka, where the ANC's Radio Freedom broadcast into apartheid South Africa. These are not foreigners. They are the children of South Africa's liberation comrades. When you attack them, you are attacking the people who gave your freedom to you. Know that history. Share it. Act on it. We came into this video with a question. Did apartheid's divide and rule strategy ever really end? The answer is, the strategy did not end. The category changed. Apartheid divided South Africans by race. It classified them into 14 categories. It allocated land, labor rights, education, movement, and political representation based on those categories. It engineered economic inequality through law. It manufactured tribal identities through census and anthropology. It mobilized traditional authority to prevent solidarity. 1994 abolished the law. It did not abolish the structure. The townships are where the townships were. The wealth is where the wealth was. The traditional authorities govern where they governed. The education system produces what it was designed to produce. And the political elite deploys the same social technology. Manufacture fear of the other, prevent class solidarity, extract in the confusion, using nationality instead of race. South Africans were divided by race. Apartheid ended. Now Africans are divided by nationality. Has anything changed? The lines moved. The engineering continued. Genuine freedom is not changing who is at the bottom of the hierarchy. Genuine freedom is dismantling the hierarchy itself. That work is not finished. It has barely begun. This has been Griot Wave Academy. Subscribe. Share this video. The African Civilisations Series continues. The liberation is still being built. And you, watching right now, are part of its architecture. Before you go, help this message reach more people. If you learned something new today, like the video, subscribe for more deep dives, and share this with someone who still thinks Africa is a country. Small conversations can challenge big misconceptions, and every share helps expand understanding. If you want to explore this topic further, scan the QR code for additional resources, recommended readings, maps, and extended discussions. There is far more to Africa than what can fit into a single episode, and this is only the beginning of a much deeper journey into the continent's history, cultures, people, and future. And if you'd like a deeper dive into any topic related to Africa or Pan-Africanism, leave a comment below and we'll cover it in a future video.